that's enough of the boilerplate. Let's get to the events of the day. Our first speaker of the year is Abigail Saguy, who is associate professor and vice chair of sociology at UCLA. I always get stuck on vice chair. It seems like you'd then be in charge of vice, or a job I always wanted. So, Abigail received her PhD from Princeton. You might have heard of it. And since arriving at UCLA, was a Robert Wood Johnson fellow, postdoctoral fellow, and has published 2 books. The first is What is Sexual Harassment? Although maybe Abigail can weigh in on the issue. Is it harassment or harassment? Is there, what's the proper? And her new book, What's Wrong with Fat, which she's going to tell us about today. So we're delighted to have you here, and welcome.
If someone wants to come and sit in my seat now, that's
We have 2 seats up front.
So I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about my work, and thank you so much for inviting me, Jeff, and to the department, and to everyone who's taken the time to talk to me today. And so this book is hot off the press. It's published in January by Oxford, and this is the cover. It's a little distorted, pulled out a little bit, but I was very pleased with this cover. Yeah, so but I'm going to try to keep to a reasonable amount of time and not digress, so that we have time for discussion at the end. So the questions that motivate this book, and so today I'm going to be pulling and talking about work from different chapters of this book, and I'll signal this as I do so. But obviously, in 45 minutes, even an hour, I can't present the entire book, so we'll just be talking about pieces of it. Invite you to read the entire thing. The questions motivating this book are, what social factors explain why we have come to perceive fatness as a medical and public health crisis? So notice I'm not using the word obesity. I'll be talking more about that, because my contention is that obesity is already implying a specific frame, a medical frame or a public health crisis frame. And I want to take a step back and ask, how is it that we've come to understand fatness? There's no real perfect neutral term, but I'm going to go with that. As a medical problem, as a public health crisis. Secondly, once we're talking about, say, the obesity epidemic, framing it in those ways, who do we blame and hold responsible, and why? What are some alternative ways of understanding fatness? We're going to be talking about that today. And what are the social implications of framing or understanding the world in particular ways, and specifically in this case, framing fatness in particular ways? And what would be social implications of understanding it in different ways? And so I'm drawing on a variety of different methods in this book, including in-depth interviews with obesity researchers, activists, and journalists, participant observation at fat acceptance conferences and listservs, analyses of the scientific literature, and I have a range of different news content analysis that I've done of different news media samples. And also, I'll talk to you a little bit at the end about some ongoing experiments that I'm doing with a former student in psychology and a current sociology student, trying to see if we can shift people's attitudes, not just about health risk, but also about weight prejudice, by having them read different news portrayals of weight. And so, in this project, I'm talking about framing, and by that I mean the selection and emphasis of some aspects of a perceived reality in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition. And so the idea here is that the world is too complex in all of its blooming, buzzing confusion, to cite William James, to be perceived in all of its complexity, right? So this is partly a cognitive thing. We have to simplify the world to just get out of bed in the morning. But there are also political implications of how we simplify, what aspects of reality we emphasize and what we don't. So I don't believe that we can have a complete, we can't get away from frame. So this is why I like the word frame as opposed to bias, right? Bias assumes that you can have an unbiased view. I think that we need to simplify and prioritize information in different ways, but that the way we do it also has really important political implications. So we see this really clearly with the American conflict, political contention over abortion, right? Do we understand abortion as women making choices over her own body? That would be a pro-choice frame. Well, if that's how you understand it, then you're more likely to think that this is something that women should be able to decide for themselves. If, on the other hand, you see abortion as murder, then of course that's not acceptable, right? So how we frame the world has really important political implications for what we think is desirable and justifiable. And this is true for weight, I will be arguing today, as much as for anything else. And the other point I'm making is that any frame is partial. It obscures as much as it reveals. Well, maybe not always as much, but it's obscuring as well as revealing. And what I want us to do today is question some of the really deeply taken for granted assumptions about weight as a medical problem and a public health crisis, and think about what's being obscured by that taken for granted frame. And so when we open up the newspaper and read articles about weight, typically we're reading about the obesity epidemic, right? This is how we've been talking, at least since the late 90s, about weight. And here in for this book, I contracted some original illustrations, which was really fun to work with an illustrator to try to think about these sociological concepts graphically. And so this is one of my favorites. And here, the idea of frames is conveyed through the opera lens. And so the idea is that everyone is watching the same opera. This is the opera of L'Epidemia di Obesità, the obesity epidemic. Italian is not one of my languages. And but they're viewing the same opera, but they're viewing it through different lenses. And so you have the personal responsibility lens, and this person is seeing an opera of sloth and gluttony and personal choices. Then in the middle you have the society frame, who's seeing a wrenching portrait of poverty and ignorance. It's not their fault, it's the societal factors that are leading to this epidemic. And over on the right, through the biology frame, a tragic saga of a fragile soul immured in a prison of flesh. So they're seeing differently. This is a reference to what I call in chapter 3 blame frames, different ways of assessing blame and responsibility. And yet, there's also this larger frame of the opera itself, which is the obesity epidemic. And so they're blaming different people, they're holding different people responsible, but they're not questioning this idea of an obesity epidemic, which has within it assumptions that this is a health problem, it's a collective problem, we need to do something about it. Down below, we see the woman trying to get into the opera, saying, I told you I'm here with the fat acceptance groups, and I do have a ticket. And she's being hushed by the usher, who says, shh, madam, please, there's a performance in progress. Her perspective is not going to be aired at all. It's not part of this opera at all. And so what I'm going to do, part of the story of this book is this type of thing that I do in chapter 3 to look at, one, we're talking about the obesity epidemic, how is it being framed? And it's being framed overwhelmingly in terms of personal responsibility as opposed to collective responsibility. And that's important, and that's an important part of the story. But what I want to do today is actually take a step further back and think about this opera as one possible frame, what I call a public health crisis frame, and think of other ways of thinking about fat that don't involve talking about fat primarily as a medical problem. And so another way that I can convey this to you is to throw this back at you and ask you, if you had to frame it, if you had to answer this multiple choice quiz, imagine this is a test, and I ask you, fatness is primarily A, a medical problem, B, a public health crisis, or C, a form of diversity that deserves a legal protection, which would you choose? If you had to choose one. And I'm not a mind reader, but I would guess that it would be A or B and probably not C. And that's, for many of you, C is not a top, even something that you've really considered. And so that's what I want to problematize today. And so now another, what we're going to do is we're going to think about, so in chapter 2, which is called Problem Frames, what this is drawn from, I actually look at 6 different frames, but that's a lot. And we're going to simplify it, and we're going to look at 3. And these include the medical frame, the public health crisis frame. The public health crisis frame is an important shift from the medical frame because you're moving from an individual level problem to a collective problem that requires government action. And then a very contrasting frame, that of fat rights. And there's a lot of information on this table, and I'm going to break it down for you so you don't have to feel you have to read every cell here. But what I want to draw your attention to is that for each of these 3 frames, there are different implications for what's wrong with fat, if anything, what should be done, if anything, what kind of larger political traditions, cultural traditions are being drawn upon, what I call the master frame, and which analogies are being used. And as I said earlier, each of these frames draws attention to some aspects of reality and obscures others. And because I'm making some assumptions about you as an audience, is that I'm assuming that you're probably more familiar with the medical and the public health crisis frame, and that I'm going to do a little bit more work in my talk today to make you question those and draw attention to some of the things that those frames do not capture, the aspects that they obscure of reality. And because I'm assuming that you're less familiar with this fat rights frame, I'm going to do a little more work to make that seem plausible. So in the book, I really try to be balanced, and this is not about me saying which frame is right or better, but because I think I just want to let you know that I'm going to be treating these differently for these reasons because of what I'm assuming about the audience. So the medical frame, what's being assumed here? Well, that very basically that excess weight or fat, which are not the same thing, and sometimes we're talking about weight, which would be all muscle as well as BMI, body mass index, is just your weight. It's your weight in kilos divided by your height in meters squared. It doesn't distinguish between fat and muscle. Sometimes we're talking about BMI, which is weight, and other times about fat and body composition. But these are medical problems. And so the solution, what needs to be done, is that we need to develop weight loss solutions for individuals in a clinical setting with their doctor. The master frame here that's being drawn on is health. Health is a priority, an important thing. Obesity is a problem because it's antithetical to health. And the analogies, I'm going to just talk about cancer for a moment. It was so in my interviews with obesity researchers, one of the questions I asked them was, given the risks that we know associated with weight loss diets, in over 90% of the case, people who lose weight on diets gain them back. Most people gain back more than they lost. And they have also shown to have negative health effects. The bariatric surgery, we don't know what the long-term efficacy is, but there's all sorts of risks, including fatality, in about 1% more of people who are having these surgery, which is a lot. Given all of these risks and ineffectiveness of these weight loss solutions, if it was your mom, if it was your sister, would you recommend that they have, say, the surgery if they were in the category? And the obesity researchers I interviewed said yes, they would. And their reasoning was that obesity was a serious illness like cancer. And again and again and again, they made the analogy with cancer, and they said if someone has cancer, that chemotherapy is risky. It often doesn't work. It often makes them sicker. But we can't just do nothing. We have to use whatever techniques we have available. And obesity is the same. And so this analogy also naturalizes the medical frame. And we'll see the other frames are drawing on very different analogies in some cases. So there's been medical sociologists have examined what are the social factors that lead to medicalization of a variety of issues. And one of them, of course, is medical expansion. So we've just seen a process in which medical authority has expanded to include many things that were not considered medical issues before, from childbirth to pregnancy to PMS. It's not just women, it's also erectile dysfunction and ADHD, right? And that these issues that were considered, in some cases, moral issues, or some kinds of just, with ADHD, these are bad kids who become sick kids, and so medical authority is a more general process of medical expansion, and this is a case of that. And so part of the story here with weight is that it's part of this larger story of medical expansion. One of the things that has been shown to enable specific issues becoming medicalized is scientific and technological innovation. So if we have a solution, if we have something like this, anyone know what this is? Recognize this? A very innovative weight loss solution from mid-20th century. Jawwiring, yeah. So the idea is if your jaw is wired shut, you can't eat and you will lose weight. It's a physically enforced liquid diet. Liquid diets are still popular, but this is a way of ensuring adhesion to liquid diet. Compliance to the liquid diet. This is a modern technological innovation, gastric bypass surgery, or in which there's different forms of weight loss surgery. In this one, you can see part of the stomach is actually excised or removed. And so you're not repairing a faulty organ. The stomach is doing what it's supposed to do. It's absorbing nutrients. It's functioning fine. This is another way of a physically enforcing a weight loss diet. When you've had this surgery, it becomes physically excruciating to eat over a small amount of food. And so the idea is that you don't overweight. You eat very little and you lose weight. We don't actually know the long-term efficacy of these because the procedures keep changing over time. So if you try to do a long-term study, then as soon as you have enough, you get to a certain period, it's no longer the same procedure and you need to start again. So we don't know, but this is the type of thing. When you have scientific and technological innovation, you have something to sell, and then you have an interest in creating the problem and drawing attention to the problem. Of course, the other great social process, important social processes in the 1980s is pharmaceutical deregulation and expansion, where the pharmaceutical companies start to being able to do things like direct marketing to potential customers, and we see things like Viagra. Once you have that drug, then this is where erectile dysfunction emerges as an illness. If there isn't a drug to sell, then there's no illness to talk about. And with weight, this is also very much at work. And so the International Obesity Task Force, which has been crucial in lobbying for making obesity a priority, not just a national priority, but a global priority, public health priority, is funded by Roche Pharmaceuticals, among others. And the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in raising concern about this, because the more concern there is about obesity, the more tolerance the public and the FDA will have for potential side effects, the more you can argue that these drugs need to be fast-tracked through the FDA approval process, etc. So, as I said earlier, this word obesity already imposes a medical frame, and this was very self-consciously done so Jeffrey Sobel tracks the medicalization of weight to the mid-20th century, the 1950s, and coming up with the word, a medical term, and using the medical term as opposed to corpulence or fat was part of the process of medicalizing this issue and saying that this is an issue for which doctors are experts and the authorities. So, like other frames, the medical frame draws our attention to certain aspects of reality while it obscures others. And what does it draw attention to? Well, that there are certain health risks associated with a high BMI. And I'm not here to say that there are no health risks associated with high BMI. There are. The strongest case is type 2 diabetes, which is clearly there's a clear positive association between increased BMI and type 2 diabetes. Of course, association is not the same as causation, and we don't actually know whether increased weight or increased fat causes diabetes. It may be, some scientists argue that diabetes causes weight gain, and it may also be that there's a third factor, or more than one third factor, that are causing both obesity and diabetes. But the association is there. The association is also there with heart disease, and that at least when you get to a BMI of over 30, so the obesity, our current definition of obesity is a BMI of over 30. It's not until you get to a BMI of over 35 that we see a statistically significant positive correlation between that higher weight and increased mortality. But at least there, it's there. So this frame, is drawing our attention to these aspects of reality, but it's ignoring other aspects of reality. For instance, the fact that the lowest rate of mortality is in this overweight group, BMI between 25 and 30. They have the lowest mortality. This has been shown again and again in a recent meta-study as well in January for this as well. Nor does this fit with the growing research on the obesity paradox, called the obesity paradox because it doesn't fit with this taken for granted frame, in which they find that among clinical populations, so people who have heart disease, people who have type 2 diabetes, it's the heavier ones that are less likely to die. That doesn't quite fit with this frame. Another way of putting this is that the higher weight predicts a range of what people can group together, factors that we can group as abnormal cardiometabolic profile. So if you have, as BMI goes up, you're more likely to have high blood pressure, high glucose, a range of things. So this study cited here, they had 8 different measures that they grouped together as a cardiometabolic profile. I think if you had more than 1 or 2, then it was an abnormal profile, problems with 1 or 2. And so what do they find? Well, clearly, as you get heavier, those with an abnormal cardiometabolic profile, your likelihood of having it increase. But if we simply say that being overweight or obese, you're unhealthy, and being thin, you are healthy, we're missing a lot of false positives and false negatives. Specifically, we're missing that 24% of people who are normal weight have abnormal cardiometabolic profile. The exact things that overweight and obesity are supposed to be predicting or standing in for, you've got almost a quarter of people in normal weight who aren't being caught, right? That we're not seeing if we just think that it's the overweight and that obesity is the problem. On the other hand, we're falsely treating as ill 56 million Americans, the 51% of overweight and almost a third of obese, who have normal cardiometabolic profiles. So we're going to move now to the public health crisis frame. This is a shift. The public health crisis frame, it's not just anymore an individual level problem, individuals who need to lose weight. Here we're saying this is a societal, either a nationwide problem or a global problem, and we need to, and this is about public resources, right? It's about shifting research money from tobacco to obesity. It's about reimbursing people for weight loss treatments, for pharmaceuticals, etc. And so this frame that we hear, one of the ways in which it's been discussed is in terms of the obesity epidemic. So, original epidemics were about contagion and illness spreading, and they're terrifying things. People dropping dead and getting other people ill. And so when we talk about epidemic, it brings up this fear. Although more recently we talk about social epidemics, or the epidemic of teen pregnancy, epidemic of gun violence, obesity is kind of in this weird middle category because it's not contagious. I say it's mostly more of a social epidemic in that it's something that people don't really like, a social phenomenon that is considered undesirable that seems to be growing in prevalence. And yet because we think about it as a medical problem, we are kind of, it sort of picks up even more of this ideas of contagion and medical pathology. So one of the people who's done the most to spread this idea that there is an obesity epidemic is William Dietz, and I'm going to show you the PowerPoint presentation that he took around the country to convince public health authorities and the general public that there was indeed an obesity epidemic. And so he shows these graphs or illustrations of the United States, and we begin with this color coding, right, where we're going from white to light blue to dark blue to yellow to orange to red. You know, the colors are very evocative as we move up with the proportion of people in each state who have a BMI of over 30, which is the official definition for obesity. Again, doesn't take into account body composition, it's just weight. And you see we're to 1998 and 2007. So that's alarming, right? If you're thinking about this as a disease prevalence, these are scary images. And so that's the analogy that's really operating with the public health crisis. The analogy is the epidemic. But it relies on a really important assumption that I want to encourage you to question, to be a little critical of, which is that moving from a BMI to 29 to 30 is analogous to contracting a disease. If we think back to that table of the, over half of the overweight people and over a third, and almost a third of the obese people who